What's going on, everyone? You're going to get a really dope episode coming up, all right? We got a special appearance this week. The guest of honor, JJ Zachariason, over from numberfire, host of the Late Round QB podcast, which is one of the longest running and most successful podcasts that have been around. It's a short form analytics based pod, and I've been listening to it basically ever since I started playing fantasy football. JJ to me is like one of the pillars, probably one of the godfathers of the analytics-based analysis. He's a very process-oriented guy, and I think that's really what I enjoy about his content, is that he's always trying to explain like why he thinks a certain way or how he approaches a problem versus just like giving you guys ranks and spitting out the players. And that's always interesting to me. As you guys know, that's kind of the mantra of what this show is, which is why I felt like he would be like one of the greatest guests that we could have, and he did not disappoint. I mean, I learned a lot during this conversation. I think you guys will too. A lot of good knowledge in there, a lot of good information. I'll try and get the time tags up there as well for you guys, which you can see in the comments. But yeah, if you like the content, make sure you hit the subscribe button, make sure you hit the thumbs up, but also make sure you go follow JJ at Late Round QB on Twitter and check out his podcast, available on like Spotify, Apple, and all that. It's called the Late Round Podcast. I will link everything in the comments down below. Make sure you guys enjoy and soak up what you can, because it was a fun one for me. I know that for sure, and I'm sure it'll be a knowledgeable one for you guys as well. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Market Watch Monday. It's going to be a really special one today. We got JJ here, and I've been waiting for this one for a while, just because, for me personally, when I started, you guys know I'm obviously like a very numbers-based person, and the first pod, like the first analytics pod I ever listened to was JJ's pod, and the short form, like 20-30 minutes of like just statistics and straight to the point bangers was kind of my jam. And I think I've listened to literally every single episode, maybe some episodes twice. So it's good to have you on the pod, JJ. For those of us that don't know you, I don't know how they don't, but maybe they're new to fantasy. Maybe give them a little insight into where you're at, where they can find you, and what you're all about.
Yeah, so thanks for having me, man. I appreciate that. Appreciate you listening to the show, of course, too. It's always cool when other analysts are listening to that kind of stuff. Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at Late Round QB, my podcast, the Late Round Podcast. I also do Living the Stream, which is sort of like turned into like a lifestyle podcast at this point, where it's just like two dads are just kind of talking and not about fantasy football. But yeah, the Late Round Podcast has sort of become my baby in the space. It's what I always say. It's what I'm putting the most time into each and every week. It's just a lot of fun. It's been fun to just sort of see how it's grown and sort of been changed and morphed through the years.
It's morphed, but it's also like kind of held true, like I said, I've literally been listening to every single one, and like the format itself, like maybe you like tweak things here and there, but the delivery of the information and just how you go about it has been pretty much, very steady. And that's something that I've liked. It's almost like you just hopped on that pod. You're like, yo, this thing works. This is how I'm going to do it. And it's been like hundreds of episodes strong. So obviously it works. And, you won the award at FSWA. So congratulations on that. That was huge. Well deserved, obviously. But yeah, man, it's cool. It's just cool because like when I think about the fantasy industry, right, I think there's like certain like pillars like that I would consider like godfathers of the industry. And when I think of like analytics, I'm like, oh, that's JJ right there.
I appreciate that. It means a lot, man. It means a lot.
Yeah, when I think of like, it's just like a lot of you guys, and it's what's really cool is like guys like you, guys like Graham, and everyone is like actually super generous with their time. Like hopping on this little pod this morning, even though you got like responsibility. So I appreciate that. I know everyone really appreciates that. I've seen you like on a bunch of live streams as well, a lot of these like up and coming shows. So it's cool, man. It's cool to see you guys give back, and it's just cool to see. Like, it's cool to see your rise. It's cool to see like you connect back with us, and it's just been dope, man. So appreciate you just like giving back to the community and just sharing your knowledge with the rest of us that are just kind of trying to learn and move forward in this thing.
Yeah, I mean, dude, at the end of the day, we're just analyzing fantasy football. Like, it's really hard for me to get a big head because I have a following on Twitter or something like that. I mean, I have a huge head physically, but that's something that I've dealt with my whole life. Putting on t-shirts when I was little was not the easiest thing in the world. But yeah, I mean, like, it's just really difficult. Like, it's cool to get recognized like with FSWA and stuff like that, and I'm incredibly appreciative. But at the end of the day, like, I don't think that I'm the best fantasy player in the world. And every single show that I go on, I learn something new. And that's really what I'm trying to do here, is to become better and better and make sure that I'm giving people, the right information. I'm not, I'm not one that really wants to just like settle and be like, yeah, this is cool. I'm at a place now where, I do this for a living and like, I can get away with, just doing whatever. I want to be the best that I can with the advice that I'm giving. And I don't want people to listen to my show and walk away and say either they didn't learn anything or what I said was idiotic. Going on these shows and talking to people like you, that pushes me to work hard at the craft.
Your show has a big impact on like my show here. Obviously, mine's a little bit more long form, but like the entire focus of my show is really strategy based. Like I rarely do like player breakdowns. I do some because people, want to see it and it does generate views. But for the most part, it's very like process oriented. It's like how I think about Dynasty, how I approach the game. So from that perspective, I think what's really cool about your show, and for those of you again who have not listened to the pod, make sure you go and check it out. And the reason why it's cool is because like you kind of share your thoughts and like how you go about something versus just giving the answer, right? And a lot of places, and I know for a lot of people, for the masses, like they don't really care about how the sausage is made. They just want to know the answer. They just want to know who the top running back is, who the top wide receiver is. But for those of you that are actually trying to get better at the game, it's like such an interesting and unique approach, because there's been multiple times where I've listened to your pod and I don't necessarily agree with something like, oh, but that makes sense, like the way he thinks about it. I don't think about it the same way, but using that type of approach, and he made me think of something else. So that's my like biggest takeaway that I ever had from your shows, is like when we've disagreed on stuff, but I'm like, damn, that's a really interesting way to think about it. How do I want to think about that?
That's exactly what I want. Like I love when people, like I did the wide receiver BMI podcast earlier in the week, and of course you love when people like respond and they're like, oh, this was so great, I really enjoyed listening to it, because you're a human being and you want to get that positive feedback. But at the same time, I like when people email me and they're like, why did you approach it this way? And asking me, why I didn't go it a different way. Sometimes those people are completely right. And I just emailed them back and I'm like, you're right. I approached this in the wrong way and I should have approached it in a different way. But I love that dialogue. I mean, we should be doing this stuff because we love fantasy football, not, because we're in a position where not everyone can sit in front of a microphone and talk about fantasy football and have people listen to you. And you gotta feel good about that. The fact that like you're doing something that so many other people would love to do. And you can't lose sight of that whenever you're doing all these shows and you're talking about this stuff, because, in the end of the day, you're just super, super lucky to be able to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. For those of us who don't know, like, your Twitter handle is at late round QB. Some people might not know like why that is. And it's because you were literally the one who came out with a very famous ebook back in the day about drafting quarterbacks late. And back in your day, people were taking like Aaron Rodgers in like the first round, right?
Yeah.
And like the first overall pick, they're like, man, quarterbacks score a lot of points. And you're kind of the one that changed the frame of thinking. I don't know how big Twitter was back in the day when you did that, but if you did something like that today, you would get absolutely roasted and toxic, right? Because it's like, oh, it's going against the grain. It's totally against conventional wisdom. Like imagine if someone came out tomorrow and said production for wide receivers in college don't matter. We all know that's a myth, because it does matter. But let's say someone did that. It would be super conflicting, right? And everyone would just like go on and roast them in the comments. What kind of reception did you get when you first released that? Because I imagine there's probably a lot of pushback, a lot of OGs that like, hey, this is my way, and this, look at this young gun trying to change the way people think.
There definitely were some OGs that were not happy with it. I mean, look, so at the time whenever I published it, this was back in 2012, which is crazy because like way back when I started and got a full-time gig doing this, I was like the young dude in the industry. And like, I was in my early mid 20s and stuff. And now I feel so old, man. Like it's crazy. And I'm 33. I'm not like, I'm not like this grandpa, but I feel so old at this point because so much has changed. There's like different phases and revolutions of writers and analysts that come up. But yeah, whenever I did it, back in 2012, that was the year after the huge passing boom that we saw, where like Eli Manning was throwing for crazy numbers even, and like Matthew Stafford went nuts. But then the next year we had 5 quarterbacks being drafted in the first 2 rounds of redraft leagues. And so at that time, I was going through stuff with work where I was fairly fresh out of college. I mean, I was only like 24 years old, but I was working at an ad agency and I was just like, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. This is not fulfilling whatsoever. So I just started like pretty much bringing all of my passions together and figuring out what I would want to do. And I really just started the ebook as sort of like a passion project in a way, where I was just like trying to have a creative outlet. It just slowly formed into this ebook that I published. And then from there, yeah, I mean, I started, I guess my Twitter account probably started in like June of 2012. And that's when the ebook was released. And at that time, I think that that audiences are naturally going to be results oriented, right? Like they're only going to care about that at the end of the day from the masses, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so with that ebook, it just so happened that, I knew going into it that the strategy of drafting quarterbacks late was just logical and it made sense, period. Like it was foolproof. It wasn't just like a reaction to what happened the previous season and I'm just going to be contrarian.
Mm-hmm.
It was a foolproof method. And so I was confident in that. But at the same time, in 2012, literally it couldn't have gone any better. Like you had like Andrew Luck coming in, RG3 had his big season, like Russell Wilson steps in. So you have these guys who, no one expected and came out of nowhere to be fantasy relevant. And then at the same time, regression hit, as we know, is a very real thing. And, analysis back then, man, it was like regression was not talked about a lot. Like something that's like so basic to what we look at these days. Those kinds of things weren't looked at whatsoever within the fantasy space. So the barrier to entry, wasn't as difficult, I would say, as it is now. I feel lucky from that standpoint too, that I got in when I got in, but at the same time, it's just with any industry, right? I mean, as things get more and more popular, this is just what happens. But yeah, I mean, there was definitely some pushback. Back in the day, there was a lot more arguments, I would say, among in fantasy Twitter. I feel like now it's sort of like I don't want to say kumbaya, but it's a lot less people going back and forth about like I remember going back and forth with people about like Rashad Jennings for like my entire Saturday, right? Like it was just like, I'm taking time out, I'm sitting on my phone or on my computer and I'm just going back and forth with you all day, getting stats together and arguing about Rashad Jennings. But there was this like mutual like respect for it, right? Because we all were just insanely passionate for it. It's just a different time. And I'm not trying to sound like the old dude here, but yeah, I mean, there was definitely some pushback, but that was kind of the expectation back then.
There's definitely lots of back and forth now, but the mutual respect part has kind of gone a little bit out the window, I found.
Yeah.
So it's hard to have like very cordial discussions on Twitter, but I still have them and I still enjoy Twitter. You mentioned you're not old by any means. Like, I mean, we're basically like around the same age. I'm 31. I'll be 32 this year. So, but you're like old in the sense that you've been in the industry like for so long. You've probably seen all the cycles, right? Like, how has the industry shifted? You mentioned a little bit about, the discussions that you used to have, but other than that, like, how has it shifted? Like, what are some changes that you've seen that you really like? And then what are some things that you think, are not so great and could probably be a little bit better?
As with any other like industry in general, as it matures, you get people that are sort of more ingrained and focused in that industry. And so a good example of that, just generally speaking, is that back in the mid 2000s, even before I was doing this stuff, I mean, even when I was in college and then, even when I did start doing this, Dynasty wasn't nearly as big as it is today. And that's just naturally what happens as you mature, right? So you start in fantasy football way back when it started, and it's touchdown only leagues, right? And then you sort of manipulate that more because people get really into it and borderline addicted to it, and so they change scoring a little bit, and then that changes into, we're gonna have these dynasty leagues, and so they always existed, obviously, but more and more people are just into it, right? I mean, I wasn't even playing Dynasty whenever I started analyzing the game back in 2012. I probably didn't start until 2014-ish when I was playing Dynasty. But now it's something that, I mean, a large proportion and percentage of fantasy managers are getting into. So I think that's really what I've seen most, is just all these iterations to the game. And, that could go into DFS and stuff too, obviously. It's not just a season long to dynasty thing. It's the fact that like we're getting these different iterations and people are able to, make insane amount of money playing DFS as well. So that's been definitely a cool thing. People loving the game as much as they do and getting to know it on a deeper level. It's like we're in a relationship with fantasy football, but like people are just like more and more into it, and that's cool. And again, that going back to like what we talked about to kick things off, like that drives me. Like you can't be stagnant in this industry as an analyst. Like you have to constantly be evolving the way that you're looking at the game and coming up with like different angles and ideas. And like all of that is really why I love the fantasy industry in general, is because there's people coming out of nowhere who sit at their desk job all day and they hate their job. And so as a result of that, they're just manipulating these numbers and figuring out like really cool stuff that like I can't do even, right? And like these guys coming out of nowhere, and it's just like, this is amazing. That's the positive that's come from it, over the years. Some of the things that do frustrate me a little bit, or not, frustration is too strong a word, but I think that as we've gone on year over year, people have tried way too hard to make fantasy football too much like the real game of football. And at some point you got to just realize, like, guys, this is a game about a game, right? Like, we're doing this, we're focusing on a different goal than what the Steelers are every time they take the field on Sunday. And that's fine. And we should just recognize that. No different than when you play a game of Risk. You know, you're not actually like, oh, I want to have a bloody war with someone, right?
Yeah.
You're just doing it because it's this like game about a game, and it's you're going about war in a much more non-violent, fun way, right? Yeah. And so like that to me, like, I've never been someone who's like, yeah, I want quarterbacks to be more valuable. I love super flex leagues, and mostly I want them to be more valuable because it's just too easy to game otherwise, right? And so, like, yeah, I want that stuff to change, but I don't need quarterbacks to be valuable just because they're valuable in real football. And I don't need running backs to not be valuable because they're not valuable in football. Because we're just, in the end, we're just playing this game about a game. So I think that's the one thing that I think people sort of try too hard, you know, to change the game to reflect that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we definitely don't want to go out there like the Steelers, because the Steelers go out there and try to lose every Sunday. So that's not something we're trying to do. But I'm just kidding. I think you nailed it right there. I've always said this as well. It's like, hey guys, it's a game within a game. Like, it's not real football. It's just a game. And the reason why I like Superflex is not because I think quarterbacks need to match value in the real world, because in the real world, you don't start two quarterbacks. But I like it because it creates another trade asset in Dynasty. Right. And it just like creates more trade action. Anytime there's more trade, I'm game for that. So we're just trying to make the game more fun. So I think, you know, some people understand that, and some people want to like really push that narrative of like, hey, let's make it like real football. But if we make it more fun, I guess that's like really the main goal. I mean, we all do this for fun. Like you said, I do it for fun. I don't really plan on, you know, giving up my day job, you know, to do any of this stuff. Cause I think I still enjoy what I do in my day job, one, and two, I'm always going to make a lot more money there. So yeah, it's interesting to think about, and you know, it's definitely a lot of great changes for the better, and you know, we got some work to do for sure, but I think we're heading in the right direction. So that's like hopeful to hear. You've written for a lot of big sites in the past. I think you wrote for like NBC, which now also owns RotoWorld, and you were with PFF as well, which is kind of viewed as like the like go-to analytics resource within the community, so to speak. And then now you're at like numberfire. Numberfire is like associated with FanDuel, or does FanDuel run numberfire?
Yeah, so I don't even know how long. Maybe it was in 2015. We were bought by FanDuel, so we're all under. I'm a FanDuel employee. We're all under the FanDuel umbrella, and so we were purchased, and you know, we've slowly sort of figured out where we sit within the company, and you know, that's evolved and changed. It's just natural because FanDuel is just crushing right now. But yeah, so I'm a part of it, but we still operate sort of like separately as under the numberfire brand.
Got it. Like, what's it like when you like get acquired for like one of these bigger companies in the space? Like, I deal with M&A a lot because that's like kind of my real job. And sometimes you see big companies acquire smaller companies all the time, and like there's culture clashes because like small companies are hyper growth, they're super flexible, and they get bought by like a Cisco, which is like a freaking dinosaur, right? And then like, you know, but sometimes the Cisco's understand that like, yo, we're just gonna let you run your own thing. We're gonna own you, but like, you know, you run your own thing. Is that kind of like the relationship you guys have with FanDuel?
It was, yeah, it's been that way for sure. Like I was hesitant whenever it all happened because I'm definitely not a big corporate guy. It's just not. I mean, I kind of got away from my last jobs before I started doing this full time to you know to not be a part of that. But FanDuel hasn't been that at all, really. You know, it's progressive, and it doesn't, you know, it's not the typical you know, corporate gig to begin with. But you know, on top of that, you know, for the first few years, especially, like numberfire pretty much operated separately, and that's and on its own. It served its purpose, don't get me wrong. But now, you know, we have a content team and a digital content vertical and stuff. And that team that I'm on, we now, you know, influence all across FanDuel instead of just numberfire. Okay. So it's the people too that they wanted to be, you know, part of that purchase. So it just turned into something, you know, it was you know, them getting numberfire and it being a part of the ecosystem there and it serving its purpose. But then on top of that, now, you know, they're using our brain. We're able to use our brains and strategize and think across the whole FanDuel brand as opposed to just numberfire.
Got it. And, you know, I know on numberfire, like you have your podcast, obviously, which, you know, everyone listens to, but then you also like write articles. Like usually you'll put out an article that's like a combination with that episode. So you can like, people can go in and dig in. And, you know, I think it's like super dope and super useful. Like I started off writing articles for like Dynasty Nerds and DLF, realized that like wasn't really my thing anymore. I just didn't really enjoy it. So I moved to video form. Like I want to get your thoughts, like, you know, video versus like written content? Like, which do you, or I guess audio as well, like which do you like doing more? And then like, if we're looking like long term, where do you think like the growth is? Do you think there's a place for both in the long run? Like, will we always have a need for articles, or will we shift more towards like consuming audio and video entirely?
Yeah, I mean, look, I would say that video and audio is going to be the best way to grow audience individually. And by that I mean if you're an analyst and you're a tout, if you're good at doing audio and video work, and you can sit in front of a camera or sit in front of a microphone, that's going to take you further than just being able to write content. Now, do I think that being able to write content is a bad thing to do? No, because I think generally speaking, even like your path and my path, it's a really good foundation because it allows you to sort of realize how to formulate arguments within the space. And that I think is invaluable because you don't necessarily do that whenever you hop on a show, especially if you do like radio or something where it's like very quick hitting. You don't think through that sort of process beforehand. Whereas if you are sitting down to write an article, you have a little bit more time to internalize and to think things through. So I think that going the editorial route first is not a terrible idea for people, even though that output, writing a piece of content, is not going to be as beneficial for you in the end. It's a long-term game, in my opinion, to be able to get the idea of how to formalize those arguments, and to be able to sit in front of a camera then and just talk back and forth and sound intelligent. And that's part of the reason why I mean, I'm obviously I'll do a study, let's say, and I'll do an article on it. And then I'll turn that into a podcast in some way, and I'll add more to the podcast and like talk about things I didn't talk about in the article and stuff like that. But the reason I do that is obviously like double dipping in a way, right? Because you want to get the editorial out there, but at the same time, you're able to turn that into an audio/video if you want to. But again, it just really, really helps you formulate the argument a little bit better, as opposed to just saying like, I'm just going to talk about this one subject. You already know that you've laid it out in a really coherent way, and that's going to make it easier and transferable when you do it in audio and video.
Yeah, that's actually a really great way to put it. And I did not think about that, but like, definitely like being able to write and formulate arguments and be concise is like pretty key, I think. Like in an article, you're not going to sit there and write 5,000 words. If you do, don't do that. No one's going to read it, I promise you.
Right.
So it forces you to kind of like constrict down, and that is a useful skill set, I think, when you come
Yeah.
to the podcasting world. So I definitely agree with you there. All right, so that was a good intro. Just wanted to get your thoughts on some of those topics, and now we're gonna dive in, man. We're gonna dive into process, and specifically like this rookie class. And we see it all the time on Twitter: film versus analytics, right? People get into it and they get big mad about it all the time. I like to use both. I know you like to incorporate both as well, but you're clearly, you come more from the analytics side. So do you find value in film-based analysis? Like, do you watch film at all? And if not, like, if you do watch it, how do you incorporate it into your process? And if not, like, why not?
Yeah, so I do watch film. I think though that like the term and the idea of watching film is gonna just be so different per person. I mean, there's people who are very, very, very good at it, and they've done it for years, and that's what they are good at. Whereas someone like me, who's probably pretty average at it, I'm not gonna pretend that that's what I'm good at and what my skill set is with this stuff. And in the end, the other thing too is that there's a numbers driven game. Fantasy football is a game about numbers. You cannot frame that any other way. It's a game about numbers. That's all we're concerned about. That's what's tallying our scores. And so I do think that there should be a strong analytical angle and numbers driven angle to what we do. It doesn't mean that we ignore film. So yeah, I'm looking at film, but I'm mostly doing that so that I sound intelligent and people trust what I'm saying, because if I say that this player, let's say that this player had really high game speed or something like that, just based on tracking. And then I call him slow, or say that he like looked slow one day or something like I just want to make sure that the things that I'm saying are matching, with what the numbers say. So everything is guided by the numbers for sure. But like every week, throughout the NFL season, I'm watching every game on Monday, whether it's like me being like totally zoned in. It's not necessarily that. It's more so I'm working on the 15 transactions column and podcast, and I have it going on a separate monitor so that I'm at least like making sure that I've seen what went on that day. I incorporate film but I don't let it be the guiding force for me. The guiding force for me is what I know that I'm good at and something that I can test and stuff that I can go back and manipulate and change based on, what I've seen over the last handful of years. I just think that, this is a game where, our goal and what we're trying to solve, our problem that we're trying to solve in fantasy football is much different than the problem that NFL teams are trying to solve. There are going to be players every once in a while who don't necessarily look great from a numbers driven perspective, which is predictive for what they're going to do as a fantasy asset, that they might actually be fine, as a real NFL asset. You don't necessarily get that as much with like wide receivers per se, but it does happen every once in a while. I think that you could even have made the argument for Henry Ruggs last year that he was that kind of player, but we knew that from an analytical profile standpoint, from a numbers driven profile standpoint, Henry Ruggs just didn't look great, right, in general. And so because we're solving a fantasy football problem, whereas the Raiders were trying to solve a real football problem. So, I think that's something to keep in mind as well. But overall, going in with a numbers driven lens, and then I'm watching to make sure that, if there's anything funky with the numbers, if that matches, and to just, sound generally intelligent with what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think I'm very similar to you in that way. Like I've never pretended to be like a film expert or anything. I watch it because I like the game, and like you, I want to see like if what I see in the numbers actually shows up on screen. So I think that's like a pretty good approach. And I also, I respect the hell out of like film people.
Yeah.
And people don't think that, but like a lot of the people in analytics community do, because and a lot of us incorporate film, like whether it's via draft capital, which is really a proxy for film from the NFL perspective, or even just like film grades from people. I think it's a really, really important part of the process. And I think what's interesting though is like, there's some analytics people that are like, man, I don't need to watch film ever, right? And that's one side of it. But on the film side, there's like, man, like numbers are stupid. You guys can't see, like film never lies. The tape tells no tales, all that type of stuff, right? That's always interesting to me, because I draw the parallel with like in real life, business versus like engineering. I think like analytics people are like business majors, and like film people are like the engineers of the world of fantasy football. Because for me, it's always easy to go like one way and not the other. If you did an engineering degree in college, you could go to MBA, get a business degree very easily, right?
Yeah.
I went the business finance route. If I want to go and get an engineering degree right now, it's gonna be a struggle. But the people that have both are really powerful, which is why I think that people that really, really understand film, but are also keeping an open mind to the analytics side, those are the people that can really like beat you and I. Those are the people that I'm scared of in my leagues. Like, yo, know film and you incorporate analytics and you understand that, because at the end of the day, analytics is not that complicated when it comes to like wide receivers and stuff like that. So it's always an interesting thought. Luckily, I haven't ran into too many of those folks. I don't have to worry about them yet in my leagues. But all you film people out there that are really good at it, if you guys start incorporating analytics, man, I really think it's going to be tough for any of us coming from the number side to beat you, because we're going to be lagging behind the entire time.
For sure.
So modeling versus ranks, you say it all the time on your pod, your model. Everyone on Twitter these days seems to have a model. Like anyone in any garage, in any apartment is popping up with a model, and their model's telling them this, their model's telling them that. Model, coming from the finance world, I'm very familiar with models. A model is only as good as whatever inputs you put in. So garbage in, garbage out. And I know this because, sometimes you put stuff in and it doesn't make sense based on whether you watch film or whatever. So you make adjustments, right? I'm assuming you do. You like your model spits out something that isn't necessarily how you would go into a draft and draft players, right?
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is you have to remember that prospecting is just insanely random, right? And so there's no reason. So like you working in finance or someone working in manufacturing or something, if you do tests, if you just do some simple linear regression stuff, and you look at like R squared values, and your company might be pissed if it's not a 99% R squared value, right? But when we're working with football, we're like jumping for joy when we find a stat that correlates to like 30%, right? Yeah. And so like you have to, people have to understand that like when we're modeling this stuff and when we're looking at this stuff, there's just an insane amount of random and an insane amount of variance to it. And so, yeah, I mean, my pre-draft process is to get my model situated and get everyone inputted, because obviously there's a lot of data gathering and stuff with these prospects. And then I have a general idea of who these guys are. But there's number one, there's stuff that changes. So like my model looks at first 3-year fantasy output. That's what it's trying to predict, right? Mm-hmm. And so all of these inputs are going into it. And draft capital is a huge piece of that, right? And so basically my model pre-draft is slightly worse, slightly, very, I mean, you could even say it's essentially the same as what you would get from straight up draft capital in terms of predicting first 3-year output, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my model will say, that's why like when people ask me about like my pre-draft like model stuff, I'm like, it doesn't matter that much right now because draft capital is going to influence this in some way,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so like my rankings then are not going to really reflect that model very much because I want to see where these guys land and what their draft capital looks like. But then once they're drafted and I input that draft capital in my model, the R squared value like doubles essentially from the sample that I'm working with.
Yeah. So essentially, for those of you guys that don't know, like the golden rule for any analytics based model is you want to try and beat draft capital, because otherwise, if you can't beat draft capital, you might as well just hit auto draft and let it take care of it. So.
Yeah, exactly. And look, it depends entirely too on what you're trying to solve. Like my problem that I'm solving is first 3-year output, whereas some people are only looking at like the hit rate to be a top 12 wide receiver or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's different, and so that's all dependent on that. But yeah, I mean, like my model, the inputs in pre-draft won't be as good as draft capital. It's close enough to where I can speak intelligently about it. But then once the draft capital is inputted, that changes things dramatically. And so my rankings are going to probably, formulate a little bit closer to being closer to the model post-draft than they would pre-draft. But because of the variance and because prospecting is just so all over the place, even for NFL teams, that's the thing, is that I think a lot of times when we talk about this openly, because I will say this about like analytics versus film people when it comes to prospecting in particular, I feel like analytics people and people who are prospecting through data are a little bit more open-minded with how we're coming to the conclusions that we're coming to with these players. And maybe people will disagree with that. I have no idea. I'm mostly thinking of like the big names in the draft space that, are coming up with their rankings and stuff like that. I think that we're more open to things just naturally changing because the inputs that we're putting into this stuff. Whereas, the film folks might not be as open to that randomness, but at the end of the day, like this stuff is random, man. Like it is. There have been studies done. 538 did a great study years ago, basically showing that the NFL draft is random. No team is truly better consistently at the draft as another team. Now, you might point to like individual teams and say like the Steelers are really good at drafting wide receivers and specific positions and stuff. But even then you get into a sample size problem. So you can't even really like say that the Steelers are amazing at drafting wide receivers confidently. And I think that that's where like the humility is a little bit with the prospecting with analytics, is because we're testing this stuff more directly and we're seeing how insanely low hit rates these teams and these players generally have. Whereas that's probably not seen as often and as frequently because there's not as much testing when it comes to the film grades and stuff like that. Film grades are great, like you said. I'm not trashing that at all. I'm just saying that like I think that people will probably be a little bit more stuck in their ways with their pre-draft evaluation than what I would be with the model, because I know that like something like draft capital is going to go into that and weigh heavily into what I look at post-draft.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a ton of sense to me. One thing that I've been battling with personally is like, not battling. I think I've reached a healthy comfort zone for myself. But people talk a lot about hit rates, right? And that in Dynasty especially, it's like, oh, like my model has 60% hit rate, my model has 70% hit rate, blah blah blah, whatever. And that's great and all. But to me, it's like at the end of the day, you're trying to solve for like the EV and the expected value of an outcome of a decision you make, right? And hit rate is one part of that, but really EV is hit rate times impact, right? And no one really talks about impact as much, which is why you see people talk about wide receivers, like they're so deep and they don't matter as much, but hitting on a stud running back absolutely like adds wins to your column, or even hitting on a stud quarterback adds more win columns to your more wins to your win column than like hitting on a wide receiver. How do you like go about approaching that? Because I haven't thought of a great way to kind of like put that into like numbers yet. I know I looked at your league winning articles. I think that was like one of the best ways I've seen to try and quantify something like that. But even then it's like hard to do in Dynasty because like you got to bring in like the value aspect of it. But you've been playing Dynasty a while. Do you account for that at all, or how do you think about it?
Yeah, I think that the one thing that I've sort of because I don't think that I'm the best like data analyst in this game, even close, like not even close. But what I try to do is I know that I understand it and I can try to communicate it in a way that, the masses will be able to understand. And so the way that I've sort of dumbed down Dynasty is that there's two paths for players to have value, right? One of them is the player is just scoring fantasy points and he's good, but the other way is appreciation, right? And the actual market. And I think that what you're sort of alluding to here is the market side of things, where everyone's looking at hit rate and saying this guy is good or this guy is not good, which is a fine, we need that obviously because we can't just be drafting like bad players all the time. But at the same time, we need to be looking also at, the positions that we're drafting, why we're drafting them, where we're drafting them, and what generally happens among those positions and among those types of players, from year one to year two, let's say. So at the beginning of the offseason, I did an episode on that where I looked at what happens from an appreciation standpoint to rookies in general. And what I found is not surprising, but it does sort of play into the productive struggle strategy that Ryan McDowell from DLF coined years ago, which is basically, gobbling up young rookie picks in startup drafts, not because those guys are going to hit at a crazy rate. And you're not necessarily looking for that. What you're really doing is you're playing the market side and you're watching them appreciate in value. And that's the side that I think is just ignored way, way too much in Dynasty because everyone's just saying like, should I have Cooper Kupp or Kenny Galladay? Like which one? And it's like, that's fine. We need to know these things. But I think what's more important to think about is, it's sort of embedded in that question, sure. But there's not enough breaking down that question to say, well, what's going to happen to these guys, 2 to 3 years? Like what is their true trajectory in terms of market value? It's always just like, who's the better player? And so, what I found was that, that side of things is definitely underserved, but rookie players, from year one to year two, when they become sophomores in the league, they increase their ADP at an insanely higher rate than veterans. It's absolutely absurd. And it's one of the few reasons why, because I've always been someone who, and I still do it, where my startup drafts, I build through wide receivers for the most part, just because they're stickier. We're going to have them for a long period of time. But it does play. And then I would use my rookie picks on running backs because, you're going to get that instant impact. But what I found was that rookie picks, you can gain the most market equity by drafting wide receivers in rookie drafts, especially in the first round. And that was something I was not expecting to see necessarily. And part of that is because rookie running backs who have immediate opportunity and such it's already sort of baked into their ADP. Like even Jonathan Taylor last year, CEH last year, it's already sort of like baked into there. So there's not that much room for growth. But if you're really looking at that equity to gain within the market, going after a different position like a wide receiver does seem to make a little bit more sense. But long story short, I know I went on for a long time there. It's really about separating the player and the player value. And I'm not saying that in terms of market value. I'm saying that in terms of like who the player is and his general career trajectory as a player, and then looking at how people are reacting to that player, which is the market.
Yeah, that's totally true. I think if we look back to last year, it's funny because, you brought up like Jonathan Taylor. I'm someone that as soon as Jonathan Taylor got drafted by the Colts, he was like a top 10 dynasty asset for me.
Yeah.
And not everyone thought that. So you could take advantage of that for a bit. But eventually, as you got closer and closer to August, what you saw was Jonathan Taylor jumping into that first round. So I agree with you there in terms of value gain. Probably not as high, even though he's probably now like a top 3 asset, which he still had an insane value gain. But that's definitely not the norm. And you're seeing people get smarter and smarter, and more people are reaching on running backs. So you are seeing that ADP value go up. So if you want to play like just that equity gain, I agree with you. There's definitely much more gain to be had in wide receiver. Now, if you want to win the league, that's probably not the
exactly
approach. But if you want to play value in the long run, then it definitely makes sense. So I agree with you there. Right. But yeah, speaking of wide receivers, man, let's get into the rookie evals. I'm really pumped to talk about wide receivers. This is for analytics people. This is like as good as it gets because like running backs, that's from what I've seen. The numbers part is kind of tough to deal with. Personally, I think the film grades actually plays a big part of my role there. But for wide receivers, like we haven't got it figured out, but we've gotten about as figured out as we can based on the data that we have. So, you talked about it in your episode, but maybe just refresh everyone's memory here who didn't listen to the episode. What are the top factors that you use in your evaluation process when you are looking at wide receivers?
Yeah, so I sort of broke them down into production factors and then sort of environmental factors. So environmental factors being like BMI, teammate score that I have, draft capital, and then the conference that they played in
Hmm.
is important. And then sort of the production related ones are breakout age. Also the more I guess this would be environmental, but like the year that they declare would
Hmm.
be another one. But more production related ones is breakout age, receptions per game, yards per team, pass attempt, and touchdown share. Those are the three big production metrics that my model looks at. And I know that it's not the conventional way that people sort of look at these things. So, you can feel free to fire away about that. But that's just what ended up, all these factors working together that ended up really improving the model and the output of it.
Yeah, I really want to dig into that because I found that super interesting. Because I think you're the only analyst that I've spoken to that does account for receptions and TDs. And based on my understanding of what you talked about, it has to do with how that like plays alongside the other factors you
Right.
chose, which is like the yards per team pass attempt, which I'm assuming is like one of the most important ones
Yes.
that goes into your model. So yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit about how you like landed on that because personally, like I don't even use Dominator because I think TDs is too big of a part of that metric. I look at basically age adjusted market share of receiving yards, but I've never looked
Mhm.
at receptions because a lot of people I've talked to who are smarter than me told me that is not needed. But is that adding like a significant portion? Like, is that adding to your R squared when you put it in? Like, how did you even land on using reception share and TD?
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's really important when people are building models that you don't want to get complex. Simpler the better. Like if you could throw two values and it creates a model for you, that's perfect. Like that's what you want. And that's really what I strive for. But what I noticed when I was testing all these different metrics was that when I went so yard like you mentioned, yards per team attempt is the most predictive of the production metrics that I work with. And
Mhm.
if you think about that intuitively, yards per team attempt is sort of this mixture of like market share with efficiency, with high
Yep.
efficiency. So if you look historically, a lot of like big play wide receivers will have naturally higher yards per team pass attempt numbers. But what I think the reason why like a receptions per game then comes into play. So it's not raw receptions, which can be skewed based on, the offense that they're in, sort of. I mean, receptions per game still can, but if they're healthy or not, for instance, receptions per game being matched with yards per team attempt, what it basically says is this guy was uber efficient and was seeing a large portion of yards within the context of his team's offense, but they were also feeding him the ball.
Mhm.
And so that's my narrative, at least, as to why those things seem to work together in unison with this model in particular. And then touchdown share, I think a lot of people test these metrics individually in more of a binary way when, yes, individually touchdown share or individually receptions per game, not a big deal. But when you sort of bring them together and mesh them with other metrics, that's when you can, they can start to matter a little bit more. So that's really what it came down to. I a standalone value, I don't really care about touchdown share, but in unison with the other things that go into my model, I do care. And so that's why whenever I do like that the studies every year on which college running backs or which college wide receivers produce like studs in college. And what I do is I take the three production metrics for both the wide receiver and running back models, and I see who hit these thresholds that were met by stud players at those positions in the NFL. And like it's a fun exercise to go through. But like for instance, like Travis Etienne didn't hit the average for touchdown share
Mhm.
within the running back model. Do I care? Not really. Like like that individually does not really matter, especially because I'm not saying like this is a threshold that you have to hit or else you're going to get a 0 in the model for your score. It's all, it's all continuous. There's a gray area there. So, standalone, those things probably don't matter that much. I'd say yards per team attempt does, but the other ones don't. But altogether, they just seem to work really well.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting way to look at the receptions one in particular because that one was the one that I had questions about. So you mentioned you use receptions per game. Do you adjust other stuff per game as well? Like, do you look at yards per team pass attempt for only the games that they are healthy, or do you just take the total?
I just take the total, and I probably could be a little bit more detailed with it, but again, it goes back to our original point that like these models and like my model isn't being published in a way that like if I had like some sort of thing on numberfire or something where like I had to constantly be updating the model because that's what people were viewing and it was consumer facing in that way,
Yeah.
I would be more specific with it, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Like, because I would have to, and I would have to care about, the order that these guys are in and stuff. But for me, it's a guide more than anything else. I'm just making sure that it all makes sense. And then, there's going to be players like Terrace Marshall, for instance, right? He only plays 7 games this past year because he opted out, didn't play the full 10 that LSU played, and then all of a sudden you're like, well, that's only 70% of his yards per team attempt that he could have potentially had. Well, I just give that context, right? I'm going through all of these players and I'm giving that context anyway. So it doesn't matter to me to and I know that I've tested this model to see, how accurate it is and how much it works. So to me, it's just not a big enough deal because I'm doing this all in the ranking side, and like the actionable piece is still subjective in some way.
Got it. That makes sense. So yards per team pass attempt, those of you guys don't know what that is. It's basically all the passing yards that were accumulated by a wide receiver divided by the total number of pass attempts for that team. So like JJ said, and the reason why I liked it, and you explained it perfectly, I got onto it because I started listening to your pod and you kept mentioning this metric. And before this, I'd only been using like dominator market share, but then I started looking at yards per team pass attempt because it makes sense, right? It's the efficiency plus the dominance that really sets some of these players apart. So how did you actually like let land on that? Like, what made you think like, hey, this would be like a cool metric to use when like everyone else is like, hey, let's just use breakout age and dominator?
Yeah, so it actually started from I think like years ago, people at RotoViz were manipulating it and working with it a little bit, and then Anthony Amico, who a lot of you guys probably know on Twitter, he was working with it, and he's someone who models a lot. And last couple of years, him and I have had pretty close contact, and just like the stuff that we were building and what we were testing and all that kind of stuff. And that was one of the things that he brought up to me. And then I started to incorporate it a little bit more. I was like, well, damn, this is looking pretty good and helping things out. And I think, to your point about Dominator too, I think that it's a little bit outdated at this point. I don't know why you can't just break out the metrics that make up Dominator and sort of manipulate things that way. And look, if Dominator works for you, it works for you. That's great. And I think that it's a good, quick reference metric, right?
Yeah.
But I do think that if you break it down, because I've always been someone who just broke down Dominator as opposed to just using Dominator. Again, I just think it's more of a reference as opposed to something that's going to be as influential as other statistics can be inside models.
Yeah, definitely. And Dominator, like if you guys don't know what Dominator is, it's basically a 50-50 weighted yards and TD metric. And TD is on its own, as JJ mentioned, is not very good, not very predictive. It's random. Even in the NFL, it's random. So it's not surprising that it doesn't really translate on its own to the NFL, which is why, breaking it down into yards and stuff is pretty cool. But like you said, it's a bit more complicated. So if you're not a super nerd, I understand like Dominator, like it's like an easy number, right? It sounds cool, it's catchy, and it kind of gets you in that same like idea. But if you want to really take your game to the next level, breaking it down is the way to go, in my opinion. And you mentioned Anthony Amico, and something he came out with recently is years of experience versus breakout age. So breakout age has been like this industry standard in terms of figuring out when players reach a certain market share threshold or dominate or whatever. Usually people use 20%. RotoViz has made the claim that 30% is much better. What is your view? You still use breakout age based on the model, what I've seen. Have you played around with years of experience at all versus breakout age?
Yeah, so I use breakout age in unison with when they declare and what year they declared. And so if you get a guy who's an early declare, someone who did really good work on this was last year, Rich Rebar from Sharp Football Analysis.
This is a great article.
So Rich is like my go-to with stuff. Like him and I are literally every day just going back and forth talking about fantasy and like bouncing ideas off of each other. And so I remember last year, he was trying to find the data on early declares and stuff because that data is not easy to get. And some of it is manual. Each year at this point, I'm like manually putting it in just because it's easier that way. But basically what he found, one of the things that he found in last year's article is that over the last 10 decades, so before 10 years, so before this past year, of first round wide receivers, 29% of them, I want to say, maybe it's 26%, were non-early declares. So they played 4 years in college. Of those players, 0 of them had a wide receiver 1 season in fantasy football. Whereas if you look at the other side, so you're looking at a sample of what's 70+% of these first round wide receivers, a solid 40% of them had a wide receiver 1 season in fantasy football. So essentially what that's showing us is, and it makes sense. Like anytime you like see these results, I always try to associate some sort of story and narrative to those results to see if it makes sense. And I think something like that makes a ton of sense. It's the whole reason that we're looking at breakout age to begin with, right? Is that we want players who are good naturally and good early, and they don't need a lot of time to develop. And if that's the case, if someone's good at football, it's not like players who made it to the NFL just started to get good at football when they were 22 years old, right? Like they were good when they were like 7 years old, and they were good throughout that whole process. They were amazing in high school. They were amazing in college. And if you're amazing at that thing with players who have already gone through the system and are already 3 or 4 years in, and you're better than them, that's telling. And so it's the exact same thing when you're looking at the year that these guys declare. It's a little bit different for like smaller school guys, because very rarely are you going to get, a non-power 5 declaring early. But of the guys that are at the same time, though, you're not getting like many smaller school guys being fantasy relevant anyway.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, you should be looking at guys who are jumping out after their 3rd year as opposed to their 4th.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a ton of sense. Like, that's how I've been dealing with it, is I use breakout age in concert with early declare. And the reason why I started looking at early declare is because of that article that Rich Rebar wrote. And that was a fantastic article. And it just makes sense, right? Because, like, it's the NFL telling these people, like, hey, come out because we're going to draft you. And if they're going to draft you, they're going to get opportunity. So I think Rich Rebar explained it that way. And that made just perfect sense to me. Like you, I'm always looking for, like, the rational way of thinking about the numbers. So it's good that to hear that you actually do account for that as well. And then I think the other thing I want to talk about is like BMI. Like BMI wars on Twitter, I can't even like get into them anymore with people because people just get way too angry about them. Like I think it's a good contextual view to see, what the upside of a player is. I don't necessarily use it too heavily in my analysis. Like, how do you use BMI? How do you approach it? What do you think about it?
Yeah, so I have 2 models. I have a running back model and a wide receiver model. Both of them have BMI in the model, but it matters. What I've tested and what I've seen, it matters a lot more at running back than it does at wide receiver. And so I think that, it's an easy go-to example, but I think that like Devontae Smith is really testing this a lot just in general, because to me, BMI is something that, like I said, it goes into my model and it matters to some degree. But there are so many other layers to a prospect and to a profile that we're looking at that are just obviously more important and more naturally more important. And so like Devontae Smith has a pretty strong and incredible profile across the board analytically. Sure, you can point at some things that might be some red flags, but before you even get to BMI, he looks like an incredibly, incredibly good prospect. And then the other thing that I think is important is the way, and I explained this on the Late Round podcast in more detail this past week. But when people analyze BMI and whether or not it matters, they're only looking at the top part of this fraction. So an example of this is they look back at previous results of where wide receivers ranked in fantasy football, and they say, see, look, 95% of these wide receivers who have ranked in the top 15 or 20 in a given year, they've been of, a 28 or more, 27 or more BMI. So therefore BMI must matter. But that's not necessarily true, because what if there's only been 3 sub 25? That's not true, but 3 sub BMI wide receivers that have ever entered the league over this time, and their hit rate is, let's say, 2 out of the 3. Then that means that maybe the lower BMI, if you get to that point and you get to that level as a small BMI guy, then it doesn't matter anymore. And if you look at historical first round picks, in particular, our sample size is really small of like smaller BMI players to begin with. So I don't think there's a lot that we can really draw from it, but even the hit rates aren't that horrible. I mean, you had Calvin Ridley a few years ago, who clearly looks like a hit. AJ Green had a really small BMI, even though he had the height. And yeah, I mean, there were guys like Tavon Austin and Ted Ginn, but you could argue that that was just a bad process pick. It had nothing to do with their small frame. It had to do with the fact that they didn't have great college production. Like they just weren't good picks. Whereas Devontae Smith at least has that entire profile. And the only knock on him realistically is that BMI part. I mean, you can, again, it doesn't, I can make the argument that he's, not the wide receiver 1 for sure. But to say that you're going to avoid these guys strictly based on BMI, I think there's a lot more gray area than that.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more there, because like, I've seen the studies and it's like BMI is this, BMI is that. But like when you get to the small end, it's like you said, like the sample is so small that like one player, If they drafted like one more player, or if the NFL didn't have the conscious bias against smaller players, like we don't know what that would look like. So that's why I'm very hesitant to kind of draw those conclusions. But what I do like to see sometimes is like that big physical wide receiver tends to provide a little bit more ceiling from what we've seen, and it could be a little bit of survivorship bias. But it's like you said, it's not something that I'm like, wow, this guy's a low BMI. That's not the reason why I'm not drafting Devonta Smith. The reason why I'm not drafting Devonta Smith is because Jamar Chase is in this draft. But
yeah, the thing is, it's like if I had a completely identical prospect, right, across the board, and one of them had a 28 BMI wide receiver and the other one had a 23 BMI. Yeah, give me the guy with the 28 BMI, of course. But when are you ever in a situation where you have this like clear-cut tiebreaker? Like they're the exact same. So like to me, Devonta Smith is already an outlier because Devonta Smith is entering the league with a production BMI combo that we literally have never seen before. That's not hyperbole. We just have not seen this before. So to take such a strong stance one way or the other, honestly, I think that you should go about it in a more open-minded way and be like, it could go a lot of different directions. That's okay. We're taking on that risk. And maybe because there is some risk that you drop him down a slot or two, but don't say I'm not going to draft him at all because of that BMI.
Yeah, I couldn't. Yeah, I agree with you. Even coming from the analytics background, like the only other red flag, I guess, not Devonta Smith, is that he didn't early declare, and he has like a little bit of a later breakout, but he actually exploded when he did explode. So it's interesting to see. Let's talk a little bit. Like, what is your top 5 wide receivers right now?
Yeah, so I have, Jamar Chase is one.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's the best prospect. I mean, like where he's projected to go in the draft, I plugged it into my model, and he's now like if he goes top 10, let's say, he will be in like Calvin Johnson, Amari Cooper, AJ Green type tier from what my model says. So to me, he's like a can't miss. I've seen a lot of people say that they would rather go Najee in rookie drafts, and I still, depending on where you're at with your team, I can make the argument for Chase very, very easily. I think he's that good. I have Rashad Bateman at 2. Just a really strong profile. It's really hard to find a analytical flag with Bateman. Yeah. And so I just think he's a very, very safe prospect. Then I have Devonta Smith 3. Then I have Jaylen Waddle 4. And right now I have Rondale Moore 5, but I think that I can make the argument that Terrace Marshall should be there.
Very interesting.
And again, this is sort of the subjectivity of like what my model says versus what I say. And we can maybe get into this, but like, what my model would say is to put either Elijah or Rondale Moore there at number, even higher potentially.
Yeah.
But my thing is you have to look at how these wide receivers project at the next level. And a guy like Elijah Moore, for instance, projects to be a slot guy, very much so. And to me, I don't care as much about production with slot receivers because it's an easier position to play than playing like a true X and playing on the outside. You need more size, you need X, Y, and Z, whatever. And so when it comes to these slot guys who are projected, like their ceilings are just naturally a little bit capped unless they can find the right spot. Like Juju Smith-Schuster found the right spot in Pittsburgh to thrive, or Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp's a great example. Found the perfect spot for him to thrive in LA. And so my fear is that I don't think these guys are bad at all. I think they're incredibly good. My fear is they're a little bit more landing spot dependent than what you're going to get from a Waddle, Smith, Bateman, Chase. Even though I do think that Rondale Moore, if Rondale Moore can find the right spot with a creative offense that will feed him the ball, because I think that you should be a little bit worried about the volume with him at the next level. If he can find the right offense, he could shoot up draft boards because I think he's incredibly talented and good. But that's why I think you can make the argument for a guy like Terrace Marshall, who played all over the field at LSU. He took that Justin Jefferson slot role this past year. But he has the right size to be able to be like an insane difference maker. And chasing that upside, I think he would make some sense at 5.
Yeah, coming from like the analytics world, like Rondale Moore, like I don't think it's hyperbole to say his true freshman season is one of the greatest analytical seasons we've seen ever. It's insane. Like yards per team, pass attempt, receptions, market share, everything. He broke out like 30% dominator as a true freshman, which is like just very, very, very rare. So I was like really, really high on Rondale Moore. And I've made the same type of contextual adjustment as you. I have Jamar Chase and Rashad Bateman 1 and 2, and I actually have them in their own tiers, like Jamar Chase in his own tier, Rashad Bateman in his own tier, and then I have the other guys. But because of that reason, because I think, they are a little bit more landing spot dependent. If they don't land in a good spot that knows how to use a slot that feeds that particular slot, you're probably going to look at a little bit more capped fantasy production. So I think it's totally fair to make that type of adjustment. And, we're not too far off on our top 5 ranks. I think I have Rondell Moore 3, Jaylen Waddle 4, and then I have like Devonta Smith. But, aside from Jamar Chase and Rashad Bateman, who I really think are in their own world. And the beauty of this is a lot of the film people I do trust and I talk to, they are in agreement. Like they have Jamar Chase really high too. They have Rashad Bateman really high too, which is like the difference in, when we think back to our analytical nightmare, N'Keal Harry, who I was completely all in on and just burned the shit out of us. The difference is like a lot of film people did try to tell me, they're like, yo, this guy can't separate. This guy is not going to translate well. I'm not hearing that when it comes to Bateman and Jamar Chase, which gives me a lot of comfort. And that's one of the reasons why I made a huge shift to incorporate film in my analysis, because that was a big blind spot. And I was like, dude, this is the wrong way to look at it. Let's get both things in there. So super good to hear you kind of think about that the same way. But let's talk about my favorite prospect in this class. He might not be my wide receiver 1, but this is a big deviation for me from coming from the numbers world. And it's Jaylen Waddle. Because if you look at Jaylen Waddle, he technically didn't break out. He never hit the 20% threshold. And, he got injured this year, and he's an older prospect as well. I think he's like 22 years old, but he is an early declare. So there's like so many red flags and so many different things. And if you're just approaching it from an analytics perspective, you're gonna be like, man, this guy sucks. This guy is another Henry Ruggs. I've heard that so many times. If I hear it one more time, I'm going to lose my shit. But everyone keeps saying he's another Henry Ruggs. What is your thoughts on Jaylen Waddle? Is he another Henry Ruggs, or is there stuff that we're missing and not seeing by kind of simply labeling him that just because he went to Alabama and didn't break out?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Waddle's the perfect example of why I'm subjectively doing rankings versus what my model's saying. I mean, look, if Waddle goes in the first round, he's still going to look fine in my model because he's first round draft capital. I say fine. It's just that he's not going to look as good as he potentially could, if he were to have better production than he had. But he's the perfect example of someone who you just need to give some of that context. I mean, this past year before he got hurt, he played 4 healthy games. In those games, he was outproducing Devonta Smith, who won the Heisman, right? Like who had this like insane year, wins the Heisman, is projected to be a top half of the first round guy. And so you have that. And then if you compare him to Ruggs, not only did he compete with Ruggs as a freshman, when Waddle was a freshman, he had more receiving yards than Ruggs did. He played one more game, but he still had more receiving yards than Ruggs did. And that's a huge deal. But then on top of that, if you look at all 4 of those games, he hit 120 plus yards. Jaylen Waddle did. Henry Ruggs did that twice throughout his entire collegiate career. So to me, this isn't even close. I mean, not only that, but Waddle in my model, his stat score, despite the injuries, despite playing with the competition that he had when he was younger, on the younger side in college, despite all that, he has a better stat score than Henry Ruggs did in my model right now. So he's a better prospect. He's a better prospect all around. Ruggs last year was a very, very clear, just an overdrafted player, just by the NFL at least. I think that that's one thing that we haven't really touched on, is that like you have to give all this context because most fantasy analysts and players that we play with are going to be more analytically driven. And so just because Henry Ruggs was the wide receiver 1 drafted, in real life, doesn't mean that that's the way that it translates to dynasty, right? Yep. So he was still the wide receiver like 4-ish or whatever last year. And that was at least fair, right? And we see that even now, like Elijah Moore has this like incredible production profile, and he's bumped up fairly high in dynasty rankings. Like he's not, whereas like a Kadarius Toney who gets a lot of love from film guys, he's ranked down low. So sometimes there's like some equity to be gained there by at least being open-minded about the analytical process and what your model's saying and stuff. But, I do think Jaylen Waddle is just not even close to the same kind of prospect that Henry Ruggs is.
Yeah, I cannot agree with you more. And, you brought up some really, really cool stats. I mean, I got some for you as well. Freshman Jaylen Waddle, 17% market share. Henry Ruggs never hit that in his entire career. And he had about 2 yards per team pass attempt, which is pretty damn good for a true freshman. Like that's a good threshold to cross. But junior Jaylen Waddle, he led the team, so better than Devonta Smith, as you said, 35% market share and 4 yards per team pass attempt, which is insane. Just an insane amount of efficiency from this player. So I agree with you. I don't think they're even close. But also, I just put on my pretender film grinder lens for a bit. I've never watched more punt returns than this season when watching Jaylen Waddle, and he's just an incredibly electric player. So I hope he succeeds, even as like a numbers person. I hope everyone succeeds. I hope Henry Ruggs succeeded. He just didn't. I think these are very different prospects, and I'm personally very comfortable drafting the Jaylen Waddle. And there's other analytics based folks like you, JJ, out there that agree, and then there are others that are like, no, like I'm sticking to my process, and he's too high of a risk. And look, there are some red flags, man. It's not all roses with Jaylen Waddle. I cannot explain his sophomore year, right? His sophomore year, he tanked, and he regressed from his freshman year, which is not good. You want to see guys progress and continue to progress as they stay in college. So I don't have any answers there, but he is an early declare, which I think really matters. It tells you what the NFL thinks about him, and he is going to get high draft capital. If he goes ahead of Jamar Chase, am I going to be shocked? No, I don't think he deserves to, but given what the NFL does, it's definitely possible. So definitely interesting. So you heard it from both of us, two numbers nerds, both giving our stamp of approval for Jaylen Waddle. So go ahead out there and draft him. Just don't come back and complain to us if he busts, because I will not be here for that. So that's kind of what I want to talk about on the wide receivers front. I do want to learn a little bit about you from the running back perspective. This is an area, admittedly, where I think I struggle with a bit. I like to lean on film a lot here, but you brought up some good metrics that you kind of rely on. One thing that you said, though, that really stuck with me in one of your episodes. You said all good NFL players produce in college, but not all good college players produce in NFL. And I really like that concept, but maybe you can kind of expand and explain to the viewers like what that means. Like how do they apply that in their process?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people, whenever you talk about prospecting through numbers, they just look at, they find examples historically of these like really, really productive running backs and wide receivers in college. And they say, why weren't they good in the NFL then? And the answer to that is not all good players and not all productive players in college end up being good in the NFL. But generally speaking, if you look across the league, good NFL players were productive in some way in college. Now, some players, there are exceptions to every rule, but that's generally speaking, that's why we find the trends that we find through looking at data. So that's really what I meant by that particular comment. And then with the running back model, I think that you probably struggle with it more because running back is insanely draft capital dependent. And it's kind of lame, but it's the truth. And the instant that you realize that, the better off you'll be. It's like, you'll see a guy like Josh Jacobs who didn't have a great production profile in college get drafted in the first round. When that happens, nothing else should matter. He's a first round running back. That's what matters most. And so, whenever I go back and look, there's going to be some variation within my model between where a guy got drafted and where the model ranked him. But even if you look at last year, for instance, like the top 8 running backs or so were basically good in my model. I think the only guy who ranked, so I look at the 80th percentile as like a threshold for what seems to hit pretty well. Mm-hmm. The only guy outside of that in like the first 3 rounds was Zach Moss, I think. And then Keyshawn Vaughn did make it in, which was a miss. But even like Antonio Gibson was inside it. Yeah. And that was someone who analytical people didn't really know what to do with him and stuff. But the main reason for that is because my model really, really looks at the receiving side of things. So the 3 production metrics that it looks at is yards per team play, reception share, and then total touchdown share. So again, some of these things might not work independently, and if you're just looking at things in more of a binary way, but together they seem to work fairly well. And I think that the main reason why yards per team play, for instance, is so impactful with reception share and how it does skew receiving, because obviously if you're a running back and you're catching a lot of passes out of the backfield, you're gaining more yards with every catch that you have. Yep. And so you're gaining more yards, and that's going to increase that yards per team play number. But then reception share, to me, is not necessarily saying, oh, you're going to be a good pass catcher at the next level. It shows team intent. It shows what teams are trying to do, how they're utilizing him. I mean, you mentioned Jaylen Waddle, wide receiver, and what he can do as a returner, right? And so if you plug in return numbers into a model, it's very hard to make them matter. But they do seem to matter in more of a subjective way, because it's showing you that these teams utilize these players in this sort of separate way and trying to get them the ball and feed them the ball. Great example of that is Deontay Johnson, right? Bad, not bad, but a fairly average production profile. He did have decent competition that I feel like people sort of like just sort of ignored because of the college that he came out of. Mm-hmm. But he was an unbelievable returner. And so if you at least have that you can attach to, with a wide receiver prospect who had good draft capital, and you're like, why did he have good draft capital? If there's that, then you can at least feel a little bit better about that player. It's a huge reason why I have a ton of Deontay Johnson across my dynasty leagues. But with running backs, reception share is just another one of those things, I think, where, yeah, I mean, we generally speaking, if a guy's a good receiver in the NFL, he was a good receiver in college. But, a good receiver in college is not necessarily a good receiver in the NFL. It just shows you that intent. And with like Antonio Gibson, I think that was sort of like his versatility was baked into that in some way. But that versatility was able to really shine at the next level because of his athleticism and stuff. So that I think is why, that in particular works within the model.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And just like, a lot of the stuff we're trying to measure intent, or like draft capital is the team showing you their intent to give this person opportunity. So that makes a ton of sense to me. I hear this a lot, in the dynasty community. It's like, oh, landing spot doesn't matter. Talent trumps all, and you should, talent never changes, and, landing spot, whatever. I personally, I think that applies a little bit more to wide receivers, because wide receivers is a little bit different in the fact that you have to earn your targets and earn your opportunity. But if a team gives you first round draft capital, and if it's a high scoring offense, that absolutely plays into my process. Are you like of the landing spot doesn't matter? How do you account for landing spot? Is it contextual? How much does that weigh into your process?
I'd say that my stance on this has slightly evolved through the years, where like maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I was in a landing spot really, really, really matters at running back. I still think it matters a good bit. But I would say that the one thing, so if we're looking at it again, going back to like what we talked about earlier, if we're looking at it strictly from like a player eval standpoint and not a market standpoint, right? If you're looking at it strictly from a player eval standpoint, a landing spot is massively important. But if you combine that with the market side of things, what I've actually found in some of my research is that some of the best values in rookie drafts are second round rookie draft running backs. And so the main reason for that, I think, again, I'm trying to associate some sort of narrative to it all, but a big reason for that, I think, is because running backs who have, let's say, day 2 draft capital, they'll often, and if they get pushed to, I should also say that it's rookie picks, round 2 picks who had day 1 or day 2 draft capital, not round 4 through 7 guys. So I think the reason that this is the case is because people are looking at immediate opportunity, and sometimes those day 2 picks don't have that clear direct path right away. So this past year, a great example of that's AJ Dillon, right? Where he fell to the late second in a lot of super flex drafts. And people weren't necessarily that into him because Aaron Jones and Jamal Williams were there. Well, obviously, there was a chance that Aaron Jones wouldn't be there this year. And people were iffy on him as a prospect and all that. I get it. But just from a hit rate standpoint, those day 2 second round picks are pretty. Antonio Gibson, another one, right? They're actually pretty decent. And then on the flip side, you get examples of like, day 3 guys who walk into a starting role like Samaje Perine did when he got drafted by Washington.
Yeah.
And he gets catapulted into like the late first, early second round in rookie drafts. So from that standpoint, if the market is saying something, I'll ignore landing spot because I want to make sure that, I'm locking in these guys who statistically it makes sense to lock into them. But, landing spot, I mean, like Alvin Kamara going to New Orleans is the best. I had just started prospecting maybe like a year before, but around the time that Alvin Kamara was drafted, like building models and stuff like that for this stuff. And I remember like hating on Alvin Kamara as a prospect. My models changed a lot. It doesn't hate Alvin Kamara anymore, thank God. But I remember hating on Alvin Kamara before he got drafted. And then I remember I have the exact show on the Late Round podcast when I went over the draft stuff. And I told people, I was like, throw out everything that I said pre-draft. Doesn't matter. Alvin Kamara found the perfect spot for his skill set. The perfect spot. You couldn't have found a better spot for him. And so that's when I'm going to lean into landing spot, when it's like a very, very clear and obvious place where that guy's going to thrive. I can throw out, any sort of evaluation I had beforehand and just sort of focus on that.
What would you say to the CEH haters, to the people that did adjust CEH after he landed in KC? Because that looked like the dream landing spot, right? That was supposed to be, people were drafting CEH ahead of, Jonathan Taylor, and stuff like that. And, we don't know how it's going to play out. I still really like CEH going forward. But, I see a lot of people out on the streets parading the, hey, I said not to draft CEH and look at him now type of thing.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Number one, I would say that I don't know if the fit objectively, like you could even make this argument entering last season. If you look at, yes, Andy Reid running backs have been very, very lucrative in the past in fantasy football. He's also had some Hall of Fame running backs, to be fair. But yes, they've been very good. But if you look at the total number of fantasy points that Chiefs running backs as a team have scored, it's not nearly as impressive. And I understand that the reason then that we're drafting these guys is because they're going to capture larger and larger market shares. But CEH during his rookie season gets banged up a little bit. They add Le'Veon Bell to the mix. And then if you look at the end of the season on a prorated basis, CEH still saw 66% of Kansas City's running back rushes per game. He had about an 11% target share. What more would you want out of a rookie season in a Patrick Mahomes led offense, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that the process was fine. If you I bumped CEH ahead of Jonathan Taylor last year. Do I regret it? Yeah. I mean, yeah, of course. Like, especially because I'm touting JT as like the second coming. And then like, this landing spot happens. And then I just change things at the last second. I had them both in the same tier at least. But like, yeah, I mean, I think that that was a good process pick at the end of the day. You're associating him with the best quarterback potentially we've ever seen in an offense that has given the RB1 good looks, in the past. The difference is that the track record for like New Orleans with Kamara was a lot stickier than what we saw with Kansas City. I mean, New Orleans every single year was first or second in running back receptions every year for the last like decade. And so you had a receiving back going into that. I mean, that was all Alvin Kamara did in college. Because freaking Jaylen Hurd was taking snaps from Alvin Kamara. And so he was a receiver in college. I mean, he had like an 18% reception share. And so you just knew it was a great match. But yeah, I mean, I think there's some parallels there with him and CEH. I would just say that the New Orleans landing spot was a little bit better.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the process is correct. Like personally, I probably would have done it too. What saved me though was when Jonathan Taylor landed on the Colts, and I'm like, before the draft even happened, I'm like, if Jonathan Taylor lands on the Colts, I don't care what happens to anyone else.
Yeah.
He's gonna be on 1.1. So part of me was like, take lock, and I stayed there, and it was tough because he didn't look that good in the early on in the season, and it's still a lot of games to be played. So I definitely think the process was correct. But I agree with you that New Orleans was like a totally different level. But let's get into this class. Who are your top 5 running backs right now before the draft?
Yeah, so I mean, I mentioned some of the stuff that goes in my model. BMI is big for running backs, as I said. I don't really care about age, and I actually don't have any sort of like conference factor for running backs. I don't care what school they come from. It just doesn't matter. I don't know. Honestly, it just didn't do anything when I was testing it and stuff. But it did for wide receivers. I think some of it is probably like if you look like David Johnson skews things a little bit, and like there's going to be those types of hits.
Can I throw out my theory here? I want to throw out my theory.
Hear it.
And the reason why I care about competition like you for wide receivers, because it's like in terms of football, that's probably like the most isolated position as it gets in terms of like skill for skill, guy for guy, going one-on-one. That's why the analytics comes into play a lot more, right? But when it comes to running backs and even quarterbacks, it's really a team versus team. Like the running backs, it's completely dependent on the offensive line. We know this, right? And same with quarterbacks. They're dependent on their protection. So when it comes to quarterbacks, people knock Zach Wilson and Trey Lance for their competition. That's not necessarily the way I look at it. I look at it in terms of gap in competition. So you look at a school like Alabama. Do they play against the toughest competition? For sure. But they're also leagues and leagues ahead of the competition. Every year they get the best draft class. Every year they get NFL talent. Every year they get an NFL ready quarterback and NFL ready wide receivers and the top offensive line. That's what Nick Saban builds around. He builds around the trenches, right? So that's why I think the competition, you're not going to see as big of a factor, because like some of these guys, these running backs come from small schools. They might not be playing good competition, but their offensive line also sucks, right?
Yeah.
And the quarterbacks, they might not be playing against the toughest defenses, but their wide receivers also stink. So I think that's my theory. I don't really know how to test it, but that's just like kind of why I think the competition really shows up on wide receiver, but it doesn't necessarily show up on running backs and quarterbacks.
I mean, what you're saying though, too, is something that we in the analytics world have tested and argued about for years, is that just talent matters a lot less at the running back position, period. It just doesn't. I mean, it matters to a degree, sure. And I've always said that talent matters most. Like I care about talent let me take a step back. So if I'm part of the running backs don't matter argument, let's say, which I think it's a stupid way to dumb things down, in my opinion, just because it's just not totally fair. But let's just say that I'm on the side that running backs don't matter as much as other people think. So people then ask me, well, then why do you care about how good a running back is? Like, why do you care that Aaron Jones is good? Well, I care because his coaches care. And at the end of the day, coaches are the ones that are throwing these guys on the field to get volume, and volume is winning me fantasy leagues. So I care about talent from that perspective. Now from a prospecting standpoint, I care about talent because I want them to be earlier round picks, because I know that front offices and coaches and GMs are looking at these guys and saying, this guy's really talented, I need him on my team. Sure, we'll randomly throw this first round pick at this guy. And so that's why I care about talent. As for my I think you asked about the top 5 guys in the class.
Mm-hmm.
I have Najee Harris first. I have Travis Etienne second, only after the weigh-in that happened this past week. I have Javonte third. I think that those 3 are honestly pretty interchangeable.
Mm-hmm.
I got Michael Carter fourth. Then I have Jamar Jefferson fifth. But I think that I could make a case for Kenny Gainwell there too. I worry a little bit about what Gainwell's role is going to look like at the next level, given his size and the way that people might typecast him a little bit. But that's about my top 5/6.
And how steep is the drop off for you between number 3 and number 4?
Massive. I do like Michael Carter. You know, people have been concerned about his like size and his weight, but his BMI is pretty strong. Yeah. So I'm not as worried about it from that standpoint. I actually thought for a little bit that Michael Carter was almost like an arbitrage play on Travis Etienne until the Etienne, until
the
he
post Popeyes weigh in,
until he drank a ton of water and weighed in at 215 and just peed the rest of the day. But yeah, so I mean, but here's the thing, you know, I got a question about that, and I got feedback on Twitter about like how when Etienne weighed in at 215, how it changed. He's the RB1 in my pre-draft model, which is sort of irrelevant, like I've been saying, to be honest, because draft capital matters so much. But he's the RB1 in my model right now, and people are like, well, how can that change? You know that it's like probably fake weight. And I'm like, probably, yeah. But are you doing that for every single running back? Because if you don't know, like, you don't know. This is the input that we have. This is the information that we have. So I can't just like be like 215 minus 5 pounds of water weight. That's just completely subjective, right?
Yeah.
So like, yeah, that's where he's at right now. Will I take him at the RB1? I think landing spot probably goes a long way for all 3 of those guys, honestly.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think I was talking with Drew Ozenchuk about this, one of my prior guests, and landing spots really going to dictate stuff because, coming in, I thought Najee Harrison would be like the undisputed, like running back one, right? But then, Lance Zierlein over at NFL.com, his NFL grades is a big input for me. And he has Travis Etienne at 6.7, like ahead of both Javonte and Najee at 6.4. And, from an analytics perspective, like you do like Etienne's production profile a little bit more as well. So it's really going to be, I think it's going to be driven based on where they land, how much draft capital they get. And Javonte Williams also interesting. He's kind of like a souped up David Montgomery. He's got David Montgomery, but like athletic is how I would view him. So definitely like, it's very interesting, this class. And the fact that it speaks to one, like how kind of weak it is, in my opinion, because like after the top 3, like I don't even want to touch running backs until like much, much later. But it's definitely an interesting class from that perspective. So I want to be mindful of your time because we're running on 9:30. I don't think we have to cover quarterbacks and tight ends. No one wants to talk about that too much. I think maybe one quick thing you can touch on is like Kyle Pitts. This is the greatest tight end of all time, is what I've been told by everyone, analytics, film, anything. Do you agree? And even if you agree, are you going to draft them early in rookie drafts, or are you like tight ends kind of like, I don't want to really mess around with that too early?
Yeah, I usually don't mess around with tight ends just because of the position they play. It's a onesie position, as I call. The demand of the position isn't as high as what you're going to get at running back or wide receiver. I don't have a tight end model. I know that generally I'm just looking for athleticism and production more. So I know factually that athleticism matters more at tight end than running back and wide receiver. I don't have, the only athleticism metric and testing metric that I have in my running back or wide receiver models is I have a threshold for speed score at running back. That's it. So tight end does matter though. And so, he has all that, right? Like it's there. The thing is, what I'm like low key worried about with Kyle Pitts is what happens if he doesn't actually play tight end at the next level? Like what happens if a team decides to switch him and his positional eligibility is switched in fantasy after 2 or 3 years, let's say. And then all of a sudden, like the main reason you're getting him is because you're trying to get that positional edge, and that positional edge then disappears and you took him over an incredible draft class at wide receiver, right? So to me, the main reason that I'm likely not going to be going after him that much is because the opportunity cost in this particular rookie class is fairly high to get him, because I think the wide receivers at the top end of this class are just really, really good.
Yeah, I agree. And some people who I really respect have come out and said, like, if he was a wide receiver, he'd be the best wide receiver in this class. I haven't seen that personally, but I agree with you. Like, if he's not a tight end, I'm definitely not as interested, just
Yeah.
because there's a lot of good prospects here. But that wraps up the rookie talk. I just want to ask a couple quick questions just for fun. How many leagues are you in, and then how many of those leagues are dynasty versus redraft?
Yeah, so it fluctuates based on like how many people want to invite me to leagues and stuff. I'm usually in about like 15 redraft leagues a year,
Oh wow!
and then I'm in like 10 dynasty leagues. So
Holy Jesus!
yeah, so I
How do
try
you
to.
how do you manage waivers for 15 redraft leagues?
I mean, like the thing. So I have like a bookmark system in Chrome. Honestly, I
Okay.
literally just like it's about an hour. I'd say it's like an hour because I generally have like a good idea of who's on my rosters and stuff. And just, for someone who like isn't looking at this stuff all the time, like I can understand how it would be like this huge undertaking because people probably spend an hour on their own league in terms of like picking up guys and stuff. And I'm sure some guys slip through the cracks because I'm not like totally in. But I'm literally just going from league to league through my bookmarks and then just like looking at the roster, looking at guys in waivers and doing it as fast as I can.
Okay. Yeah. I'm in like 20 something leagues, but I only play like one or two redraft leagues now. And the reason is honestly it's because of waivers. Like dynasty waivers, you
Yeah,
guys don't
it's
know. It's like
totally different.
it's totally different. Like if you find like James Robinson is probably the greatest waiver wire pickup of all time. Like already like based on that one season in dynasty because of how deep it is. But yeah, redraft leagues, respect you for taking the time to do that. I just couldn't do it personally. I want to know this. So I'm sure you play in leagues with a lot of other like analysts, well-respected analysts in the industry. Who's like the toughest player you've ever played against in a dynasty format?
Probably Ryan McDowell.
Ryan McDowell, the OG.
Yeah. Probably. And the reason is because I always because I've done I'm probably in like 4 or 5 leagues with him at this point, but I feel like I definitely have changed my philosophy in dynasty because he's been playing longer than I have.
Mm-hmm.
And look, to your question about redraft versus dynasty, like redraft is my background and like I slay redraft, so I'm not giving it up. You know what I mean? Like it's like the thing that I crush redraft. And so I never want to like let that go. But with dynasty, there's just so many different angles you can come from and so many different approaches. And when I first started doing leagues with other analysts and stuff, I just remember like watching Ryan's drafts and being like, what are you doing? Like, what's going on right now? And then he would just crush year 2, like every time. Yeah. But I played him in a few championships and stuff. He's always good competition. I'd say probably McDowell.
Yeah. OG Ryan McDowell, guys who don't know who he is, one of the partners over at DLF, Dynasty League Football, one of the OG sites when it comes to Dynasty. Super good resource. Go check him out. So apparently also very, very good Dynasty player. So if you're buying what they're selling, hopefully it's improving you as well. And then the last question, something that I've noticed this season, I don't know if you've been doing it before the season or not, maybe you have, but retirement announcements on Twitter. Now, I want to know, 1, how that came about, and 2, like the toll that it's taken on your life, because the comments when you post one of those just absolutely explodes, and it's just an entire cesspool of 1, people that don't understand the joke, 2, people like me that love the joke and just egg it on, and you just get like this clash of interesting dynamics.
Yeah, so I don't know how or why it started. I think it was like a joke that Denny and I on Living the Stream used to mess around with randomly, and then I just decided to start tweeting about it. So if someone's having a bad day, I try to do like a reverse jinx and like turn things around and say that they retired early. So if like Tyreek Hill doesn't have a catch in the first half, be like, oh, it's crazy that Tyreek Hill decided to retire before this game. And so I send these tweets out and I do it from a reverse jinx standpoint. And they're the worst jokes imaginable. But they're purposely terrible. Like I'm totally aware of how bad these jokes are. And so people will respond and be like, what are you talking about? I've seen him on the field. He didn't retire. And then you have people who are like searching, who have like a Tyreek Hill keyword that they get like notifications for on Twitter. And so like I get these randoms who don't follow me who are then like then Tyreek Hill blows up in the second half, which was totally the intent of the tweet. Like that's why I did it. And then they start like making fun of me for saying that he retired when he then blew up. So I would say it's become more of a detriment than something that I enjoy. But at the same time, I've gotten to the place on Twitter where I just don't care anymore about like the responses so much. So
Yeah.
I just like troll them back or jab back whenever they start being jerks to me.
Yeah, that's a fun place to be. That's kind of where I'm at. I see you're taking that route as well, and I like it. And we appreciate your sacrifice. You you tweeted a couple that saved me in the playoffs, so I was very appreciative of that. So hopefully you keep doing that, as long as it doesn't take too big of a toll on your life.
No, man, it's
It's greatly appreciated. But yeah, so that's all we got. I mean, you took more than generous your time. We're already like almost 10 minutes over. So just want to say thank you for coming on. I've personally learned a ton. I know my viewers are going to learn a shitload once I edit this and get this out for Monday. But let the people know, where they can find you, where they can read about your stuff, hear your stuff, and just, keep learning from you going forward.
Yeah, man. I'm on Twitter at LateRoundQB. No retirement tweets over the off season because there's no football going on. But you can look forward to those during football season. And then the podcast, the Late Round Podcast, you can search for that anywhere. And then all the written stuff over on numberfire.com. March Madness coming this week. We got a lot of that going on. We don't just focus on football. And our numbers, man, they have crushed over the last like 5 or 6 years. So I'm really pumped for it. Yeah.
Do you dabble in that a lot yourself? Or are you kind of leading the charge on the March Madness stuff?
So I used to when we were smaller. Now we have enough, people who can help out and stuff and manage that. So I do one article every year now for March Madness where I look at what our numbers are saying in terms of probability to get to the Final Four and to win the finals. And then I look at ESPN's who picked whom data. And so you're basically playing the market and playing to see in the game theory side of things to see what people are picking in their pools and then just sort of maximizing your EV that way.
That's super interesting. So yeah, if you guys want to check that out, I'll have all the links below. You see his handle down to the bottom left, I guess, as well as the numberfire site. So make sure you guys will check it out. I'm telling you, make sure you check out the podcast. Like if you don't want to read or whatever, just at least go check out the Late Round Podcast, because I think I've probably learned just a shitload of stuff. Just listen to that. And you have like how many episodes you put out? Like it's insane the number of episodes you put out actually.
Yeah, I'm about to hit I'm almost to 500. Yeah, it's getting up there.
It's absurd because you put out like what, 3 a week?
Yeah, so I do 4 a week in season and then 2 a week during the off season.
Yeah. Okay. So lots of content there. And honestly, like I go back and listen to some of the episodes because like they are very process oriented. Maybe some of the player stuff doesn't apply anymore. So it's not one of those pods where you have to just start from episode 500. Like, oh shit, like I can't catch up anymore. Like go back and listen to some of the pods, especially like the ones on like the rookie breakdowns, like the processes. If you play Dynasty, I think those are super helpful. And then when you're in season in the league, like one of my favorite episodes of all time is the like kind of like the death of the target hog wide receiver, like how that has shifted the game. So yeah, make sure you go back and look at the other episodes. Don't just look at the new ones because there's some really good gold nuggets back there. It's for you guys to check out. But yeah, last thing, just thank you, man. Thanks for coming on. I've been a long time. Truly, I say this a lot of times as a joke, but to others, but I've actually been a long time listener and a big time fan. So it's good to kind of have you on the pod and pick your brain. And thank you for your time on this Saturday morning.
Yeah, man. Appreciate you having me.